Welcome to episode 6 of Secure My Treasures podcast series. My name is Shah Weeks. I'm the founder and director of Secure My Treasures. We produce these podcasts as a community service. Secure My Treasures is a bank-grade, secure digital safe. You can securely store all of your vital information in Secure My Treasures chests. You can authorize trusted family or friends to access specified information in an emergency. That can spare you and your family unnecessary distress, inconvenience, and cost. I'm very excited about today's guest. It's somebody I worked with a very long time ago, and I'm so pleased to welcome today Liesel Wett, OAM, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Pathology Australia. Liesel is passionate about ensuring that every Australian has affordable access to pathology tests. And I echo that passion. Liesel, I'm guessing that when some patients leave their doctor's office, they have little idea of the connection between pathology and their doctor's need for them to have a blood test. What would you
That's
say?
right. Thank you so much for having me today. It's great to be here. I think you're probably right about that lots of people don't understand what pathology is. And it seems to be a little bit of a black box to some people. Pathology itself is actually the study of disease. And pathologists who are specialist doctors, so they've got postgraduate qualifications, just like other consultant doctors, they actually diagnose disease to help other doctors, or to you, the patient, and other doctors to decide what treatments we might need. If you've ever had a blood test or a swab or a biopsy, you've actually received a service from a pathologist who's diagnosed your disease. And pathologists are actually often called the doctor's doctor. Other doctors need them to diagnose disease to help decide what treatments or drugs or what interventions you might need. Over 70% of all medical decisions and 100% of cancers are diagnosed by a pathologist in the laboratory. So that's the role that they play. It's such an essential role. They're supported by scientists and senior scientists that might get samples ready or calibrate technologies or order systems and machines and reagents that all go into that diagnosis process. So it really is an essential medical service and something that we need in society, in part of our healthcare.
Thank you. I think you're right that a lot of people see a bit of a black box between the doctor giving you the form to go to pathology and telling you to fast or not fast, whatever, and then you going back to the doctor to find out what's happened between you and the ways with the form. Most pathology forms have a string of letters or words on them that look a little bit like hieroglyphics, something like LFT, BUN, HbA1c. What are those letters?
That's a whole other language, isn't it, Shah? Some of those things are actually shorthand for your doctors, mostly GPs, to refer you for particular tests.
It really is a whole nother language, isn't it, Shah? So HDL, or high density lipoprotein, is often referred to as the good cholesterol. So if your score is low, we actually want it to be quite high. If your score is low, that might indicate that something is going wrong with your body and ultimately with your healthcare. So it's really important that we understand what those letters actually mean.
Doctors often use shorthand. It's important for us as patients to actually understand what that shorthand means, because we should be part of that decision-making process in our healthcare, and we need to be informed about what sort of tests we're having. A lot of these things are blood tests. A HbA1c is something that monitors your glucose in your blood. So people that might have a diagnosis of diabetes, that's really important for them to understand what their results are saying. what their treatment might be as a result of those results, or how they can take more control of their healthcare. They're important things for us to understand. And there is actually a website, it's called pathologytestexplained.org.au. And you can jump on that website and put in all those hieroglyphics in there that you might have on your pathology referral form and actually figure out what it is, what those tests are. The other thing you can do is ask your GP or your specialist when you're having them what's going on. Most of the time, our colleagues will actually explain what all those letters mean. But you can, if you want to go away and have a look at what those letters mean, you can jump onto that website, pathologytestexplained.org.au, and have a look at what does HDL actually mean, what does HbA1c actually mean, and why am I having those tests in the first place?
That is so helpful. We might tell listeners there's well over 200 of those hieroglyphics listed on that website.
Yes.
You're right. It is really important for patients to understand their pathology test results. And if they're understanding what they're going to have a test for, it's important that the other end, they ask what those results revealed. And do you have, just as an aside, do you have any ideas about ways that patients can make sure that they get that information in their consultation with their GP? Asking that because oftentimes patients go back to the GP to get their results and they might say, oh, yes, it's all okay.
Yeah, I'm pretty lucky, Shara. I have a wonderful GP that makes sure I get a copy of all my pathology results or whatever it is that I'm getting. But it certainly is something that I think all of us as Australians, as patients, because we all become a patient at one time, don't we? We all become a consumer of health services. It's important that we understand what's going on with our own health so that we can take as much control as we can. Sometimes there are decisions that are taken out of our hands, but understanding what's going on with our own bodies is really, really important. And particularly now, there's all this explosion in medicine around genetic testing and genomics. So genomics or precision medicine, same thing. It's about our individual gene makeups and what that means for certain treatments. And one of the familiar ones you would have heard of and your listeners would have heard of is things like the BRCA gene for breast cancer. That's a genetic test. It's a new technology that's been introduced probably in the last 10 years now. But that can determine whether you have a treatment or not, or whether a treatment will actually work. If your particular genome is saying, yes, it's positive to the BRCA gene, then there is a whole avenue of treatment for you that will have better results for you, have greater outcomes for you to live a healthy, happy life. If you don't have that gene, there's no point in having some of those treatments that often are quite aggressive, let's face it. So that's just one example of how if we understand what our doctor's doing and we have a great relationship with our doctor, we can get better outcomes from that whole process of testing and genetics and using the latest evidence, the world's best practice globally, evidence on what the best treatments are for us, depending on our...
That is so important. I remember back to being very young and going to the doctor for tests and then getting a bill for them, which in my youth, I found those bills hard to pay.
Yeah.
I was shocked by what seemed to be a simple test cost so much. So I'm just wondering, how many people understand how much it costs to look at something like the BRCA gene?
Yeah, I'd say not many people, including clinicians that are referring you for that gene in the first place. One of the things that I think is important to understand as medicine, as we go forward in leaps and bounds and we have these amazing genetic tests, none of them are cheap, sadly. A lot of the time, what we do as the pathology sector and what my clinicians do that are working in these cutting edge areas, they often take those latest tests to the Department of Health, to the government, to go through a process to look for support with a Medicare rebate. And what that means is that instead of paying large out-of-pocket costs, you can actually get a Medicare rebate, which belongs to you, the patient. Medicare is a patient insurance scheme. That means that those out-of-pocket costs are small or not existent. Now, the problem with what happens in that process is it takes a long time for the government to decide that they're going to support us with a Medicare rebate as patients. And then other times they make decisions that unfortunately mean that patients do have to pay out-of-pocket costs. Just as an example, the PSA test, everyone would have heard of a PSA. It's a prostate cancer test. It's now a blood test, which is fabulous. Lots of your male listeners will be happy that's just a blood test these days. But that test, the government decided to change the rules around how many of those tests you can have. So at the moment, you can only get a PSA test once every 2 years, whereas you used to be able to get them once every year. And lots of doctors want to make sure that their patients are monitored, and so that they refer them for an annual test. Now, what that means is that, sadly, there's an out-of-pocket cost for that. And that's between $40 and $50, depending on the laboratory. And in this example, that's pretty much covering the costs of the pathology laboratory actually doing the test, and the reagents and the process and the pathologist reporting and all those sorts of things. So it's really important. We don't want to see I don't think as a society, we want to see people making choices about whether they get their essential tests, their essential blood tests, or putting food on the table, or paying the rent or the electricity or the petrol in the car. And that's pretty tough at the moment. I reckon your listeners would be saying to you, Shah, that the cost of living crisis is really pushing us at the moment. We have to make choices.
That's right. Just in where I live, people making a choice between going to the doctor and doing something else with that same money, because they can't afford, if they can afford to go to the doctor, they might not be able to afford the prescriptions that go with it. And as we all know, that over time, when you don't look after your health, then you leave yourself open for health issues to arise.
Yeah.
So really, it's a big trade-off.
It is. And there's so many, I could talk about so many important sorts of pathology tests. There's a whole practice of histology, which is actually the study of when our surgeons take pieces of our body out, where there's a suspected cancer or some sort of growth that they're really worried about. But there's a whole practice of histology where the surgeon, you'll be on the table knocked out under a general anesthetic. The surgeon's taken that piece or that cancer or whatever the growth is that's not fabulous. You're still asleep on the table. That sample is rushed down to the pathology lab. It's frozen. It's set in wax. It's sliced to some minute thinness. And a pathologist will be there actually diagnosing that disease while you're still asleep on the table before the surgeon sews you up. So we don't want to see more out-of-pocket costs. We don't want to see that those sorts of, like, how important is that? To have that histopathologist diagnosing your cancer and saying, yes, the surgeon's got it all. There's clear margins. We might have heard that sort of statement. Clear margins mean they got the whole sample out. There's no more cancer in the body. We don't want to see those stop being bulk bills because they're just so important.
I think you make a really clear case for affordability, because at the end of the day, especially when it comes to histology, if cancers are missed, lives are lost or shortened or changed in unimaginable ways.
Yes. Yeah. All very true, Shah. All very true.
So how much would it cost a patient to have a test done, say, if it's not for bulk billing? Say it might be something like thyroid function.
Okay, so that will depend on the laboratory and depends on the test or the bundle of tests. At the moment, sadly, the government is looking at cutting Medicare rebates for vitamin B12 and urine tests. Sadly, for those tests, bulk billing is a bit under threat, but it could be anywhere between $40 or $50 to $100. So that's not insubstantial. That's quite a lot of money if you have to have some of these tests all the time, and we know some people need to have regular tests for their particular health conditions. And sadly, as we get older, we need more tests because things go wrong. But really, as a pathology sector, my members, the pathology laboratories, they don't want to charge patients. They want people to have the test. They want them to return all the time because they're so important. And their doctors rely on those results. They don't want to have to charge people out of pockets. But if the government decides that they are going to change the Medicare rebates or they're going to cut the Medicare rebates, remembering the Medicare rebate belongs to you, the patient, then at some stage, the pathologist has to be able to cover the costs of what they're doing to deliver a test. So we're so lucky in this country because for the majority of tests, our turnaround times are like 2 days. So you can have a result within a couple of days to whatever it is, whatever your condition is, the important monitoring of your diabetes control, the thyroid function test to make sure that you've got energy every day to do whatever it is you need to do. So they're really important tests. We don't want to see out-of-pocket costs, but if government keeps cutting, that's what's going to happen.
That's a pity for all of us. I might say
Absolutely.
something. All right. So, Lisa, your passion about pathology really has come through in this podcast, and thanks for sharing information that's going to help every one of our listeners to better understand what happens with their tests. So I'm aware that you have a campaign running to encourage people to support the continuation of bulk billing for pathology. Would you mind telling us a little bit about that?
Of course. Since last year, we've actually been campaigning with the Australian community, talking about the importance of keeping pathology bulk billed. And that's because we know that we don't want people to have to make choices between their essential tests and other things that they need to do, put petrol in there, feed their kids, etc. Our campaign, which is called Keep Pathology Bulk Billed, is exactly that. It's asking the Australian community to write to their local member of parliament and ask them to invest in pathology. And our campaign is easy to find. We're talking to all Australians all around this wonderful country we live in. And if you go to keeppathologybulkbilled.com.au, you can actually write to your local MP and talk to them about reversing the cuts to Medicare so that we can keep pathology bulk billed and nobody has to pay any out-of-pocket costs for pathology. I'd encourage all your listeners to jump on to keeppathologybulkbilled.com.au, put your postcode in, and you can zip off an email to your local MP. And now's a really great time to be doing that.
Thanks, Liesel. And listeners, now's your chance. Thanks for joining us today, Liesel. Listeners are sure to appreciate your deep understanding of how pathology adds value for everyone's patient care. To Secure My Treasures listeners, please head over to our YouTube channel or the podcast page on our website, where you'll hear all of our podcasts again, starting with Liesel's. That's at www.securemytreasures.com, where you can live it, love it, or lock it.